Flames licked across the horizon as orbital strikes hammered down, each impact shaking the ground hard enough to throw dust and shards of glass into the air. Civilians were screaming in the distance, their voices cut short by collapsing structures or swallowed by the roar of another detonation. Helen ducked behind the husk of a transport hauler, her breath sharp in her throat. The metal was hot against her back, scorched from a near miss that had left the vehicle twisted like a crumpled can. Her sidearm was useless against the things moving overhead, but her hand gripped it anyway, because empty hands felt like surrender. A shadow crossed the ground, stretching longer, wider, until the sky itself seemed swallowed whole. Helen glanced upward and felt her stomach twist. The Doomspire hung there, a fortress so massive it bent the clouds into spirals around it. Its surface gleamed with sickly light, every edge pulsing as though the thing had veins. She had seen warships before. This was not a warship. It was a verdict. A cluster of civilians stumbled past her hiding spot. A woman clutched a child to her chest, the little boy coughing in the ash. Helen pushed herself out from cover, waving them down an alley between fractured towers. "Go!" she shouted. Her throat burned from the smoke. "Keep moving, don't stop for anything." They ran, but the boy looked back once, his wide eyes fixed not on Helen but on the monster in the sky. Helen knew she should be running too. The evacuation shuttle was supposed to launch 10 minutes ago, and if she wasn't aboard, she would be left behind. But something kept her rooted, something more than duty. She had lived through the First War with the Ascendants. She had seen how humanity had scattered, how people begged their leaders to sign treaties, to hide, to survive quietly. And she had buried her brother after their last stand collapsed. Another strike came down, closer this time. The blast ripped open the avenue ahead, hurling chunks of ferrocrete across the street. Helen hit the ground hard, coughing, ears ringing. Through the haze, she saw something blinking weakly in the rubble. It wasn't debris. It was a beacon. Crawling forward, she dragged the device out, wires dangling like torn veins. Its casing bore the crest of the United Earth Research Division, the same outfit whispered to be working on impossible weapons, desperate projects nobody wanted to admit existed. The beacon sputtered once, then crackled to life. A broken voice pushed through static. "They can bleed. Repeat, they can bleed. Cut the anchor and it collapses." Doomspire isn't. The transmission cut, leaving only silence and the distant shriek of another bombardment. Helen froze. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Cut the anchor. Collapse the Doomspire. It wasn't invincible. "Captain," a voice barked through her earpiece. It was Oliver Kent, her navigator, young enough to still believe he should have had a normal life before this war swallowed him whole. "Shuttle's prepped. We can't hold the pad forever, you need to move now." Helen's fingers tightened around the beacon. She looked up again at the Doomspire, its surface thrumming with an energy that felt wrong, like standing too close to a storm about to split the earth open. Her body screamed at her to run, to make it to the shuttle, to live another day. But in her hands, for the first time in years, she held more than survival. She held a secret the Ascendants never wanted humanity to hear. She forced herself to her feet, every muscle aching, the ground quaking beneath her boots as another orbital strike landed behind her. The shuttle was waiting. So was Oliver. But so was the truth she had no right to ignore. The shuttle bay doors sealed shut behind them with a metallic slam. For a moment, the only sound was the groan of overstressed engines straining to leave the atmosphere. The cabin stank of smoke, sweat, and the acrid tang of burned wiring. Helen slumped into a seat, the beacon still clutched in her hand like a relic. Her body trembled, not from fear, but from the raw aftershock of what she had seen. Oliver Kent sat across from her, his face pale under streaks of grime. His hands shook as he pulled off his headset. "You were late," he said, voice clipped, more accusation than relief. "You damn near missed it." Helen looked at him, exhausted, then at the device. "I found something." He let out a humorless laugh. "What? Another reason to keep us in the line of fire?" The shuttle lurched violently as the pilot broke atmosphere, throwing both of them against their harnesses. Through the small viewport, the colony shrank below, still burning, still screaming. Then it was gone, hidden beneath clouds of smoke and fire. Oliver swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the viewport. "We left them." Helen didn't answer. She could still hear the child's coughing, the mother's frantic run into the smoke. She forced herself to look at the beacon again, to remind herself there had been purpose in her delay, that it wasn't just failure stacked on top of failure. The shuttle docked hours later with the Lunar Command Hub, a structure hanging in orbit like a steel crown above the dark side of Earth's moon. The hub was crowded, corridors thick with officers, engineers, and civilians pulled in from fractured colonies. The air smelled of recycled oxygen and fatigue. Inside the command chamber, the tension was thicker than the smoke back on the colony. Screens showed real-time reports from across human space, red markers spreading like infection. The ascendants were advancing faster than anyone could believe. General Grant Holloway stood at the center, hunched over a tactical display. His uniform was immaculate, but his eyes were bloodshot, his jaw clenched as if he had been chewing stone. When he saw Helen, something flickered across his face: recognition, weariness, and the faint shadow of guilt. "You're still alive," Holloway said, his voice gravelly. Helen set the beacon down on the table. "Barely. And I didn't come back empty-handed." The room quieted. Officers leaned closer, curious but cautious. Holloway raised a brow, waiting. Helen powered the device, coaxing out the fractured transmission. Static hissed, then the broken voice filled the chamber. "They can bleed. Cut the anchor and it collapses." The message died again, leaving the words hanging like smoke. Silence followed, a silence that carried both weight and disbelief. Oliver broke it first. "It's something, isn't it? Proof the Doomspire isn't invincible." One of the council members scoffed. "Or it's bait. You risk destabilizing what's left of humanity over a broken transmission." Holloway's eyes stayed locked on Helen. "You believe this?" "I do," she said firmly. "I saw it with my own eyes. The Doomspire feeds on something. If we cut it off, it falls apart." The general's lips pressed into a hard line. He tapped the table, zooming in on a display of the Doomspire in orbit over another colony. Its sheer size dwarfed everything around it. "Even if this is true, how do you propose we get close enough? We throw ships at it, they'll burn before they scratch the surface." Helen leaned forward. "Not ships. People. The team. Get inside. Sever its anchors from within." The chamber erupted in voices, laughter, outrage, disbelief. The very idea sounded suicidal. Oliver's hand slammed the table, startling more than a few. "We're running out of colonies to lose. You've all seen the reports. In a month, there won't be enough of us left to argue about strategy." Holloway lifted a hand, and the noise died. His eyes narrowed at Helen. "You're suggesting infiltration against a fortress that eats stars." "I'm suggesting we stop pretending survival is enough," she shot back. "I buried my brother because we kept running. How many more do you want to bury before you admit this isn't about surviving anymore? It's about fighting." For a moment, neither spoke. Just the hum of the displays and the muted chatter from outside the chamber. Finally, Holloway said, "If I approve this, you'll be leading it." "Not me." "And if you fail, humanity loses its last chance." Helen's throat felt dry, but she didn't flinch. "Then I won't fail." The counselor who had scoffed earlier shook his head, muttering, "Arrogance will finish us quicker than any alien." But Holloway didn't look at him. He looked at Helen. And for the first time in years, he almost smiled, though it was bitter. "I should have known you'd drag us into another fight." Helen leaned back, her chest tight, not with fear but with the weight of what she had just agreed to. For the first time since the colony burned, she saw a path forward. Oliver glanced at her, his eyes still lined with doubt, but his voice carried something else now. "Guess we're not running anymore." The chamber's alarms suddenly flared, bathing the walls in red. A frantic officer shouted, "New contact! The Doomspire has shifted position. It's entering orbit over Europa colony." Every face turned toward the display. Another colony. Another 3 million souls. Holloway's jaw tightened. "Looks like your fight just came sooner than you wanted." They did not have the luxury of polishing a plan. Time had been stolen from them, and every second they spent arguing was another world with people still breathing, another school, another market, another life that might be crushed to ash. Helen felt that weight in her shoulders like a physical thing. It made her move faster, speak straighter, and refuse the small comforts that came with hesitation. The briefing room smelled of coffee gone cold and the metallic tang of oxygen scrubbers. A hollow map of Europa Colony floated over the table, projected into the air like a ghost city. Streets, domes, transit lines, supply yards, all marked in neat, blue geometry until someone toggled the overlay that showed the Doomspire's approach. Then the lines jittered, became hot and angry, and the map looked less like a city and more like a target. Grant Holloway did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When he cleared his throat, the room leaned in as if the sound were a command. "We will not choose gallows where there is a ladder," he said, and his voice had that brittle steadiness that happened when a man had learned to keep panic behind glass. "We are not here to wave flags. We are here to take a weapon out of their hands." Helen watched him. He had the same ridge of stubbornness she had seen before. He had given orders that saved lives and orders that cost them. He had the look of someone who knew the ledger of both. Oliver's fingers traced a pattern on the table. He was younger than most in the room, but his jaw had hardened. "We can slip a team in under cover of the orbital disruption," he said. His voice was steady because he had rehearsed this speech in the quiet hours. "We get in, we find the anchor conduits, we sever them. Minimal engagement if we can avoid it." A commander near the doorway shook his head. Minimal engagement. Beautiful words. He smiled without amusement. "You assume the Ascendants will let a human hand touch anything in their sanctum without shredding it, Kent." Helen cut in before she thought about the ripple of consequence. She had wanted this. She had asked for it and she had to own what came next. "We are not assuming," she said. "We have information. The beacon. It said the Doomspire bleeds when its anchors are cut. We will use that. We will not waste our ships and our people in a frontal fight because we do not have to." Holloway looked at her then, full on. Often his expression was a map of compromise. Now it was a ledger, balancing risk against hope. "You know the casualty estimates," he said. "You understand what you are asking of your crew." "You will ask of them what I would not ask of myself," Helen answered. "I will go inside. I will lead the team. If I die, then at least my decision is mine." Tension followed the words like rain. Someone hissed. Someone else swallowed. Oliver met her eye. He did not make a speech. He did the small, human thing that mattered more than any vow. He stepped forward and laid his palm flat on the table where the holograph shimmered. "I am with you," he said simply. "I am not leaving this to generals who think in battalions. I am going where you tell me to go, Helen." It was the kind of line that could have been theatrical. Instead it felt like someone picking up a wet coat and handing it to you when you were cold. Others shifted. Two engineers who had worked on the beacon earlier exchanged a look, a small nod, as if deciding in their chests to make themselves useful in whatever way they could. Over the next days, everything became calibration. They rehearsed tunneling procedures in simulated gravity wells. They practiced cutting through heat sinks and magnetic lattices on feeders built from old superstructure. They adapted human tech to alien geometry and found 100 small failures that had to be fixed with human stubbornness rather than fancy equations. The team became a ragged collection of people who had nowhere else to go. There was Maeve, a salvage diver who laughed when she should have cried and kept a photo of a dog taped under her helmet. There was Jonah, who had been a schoolteacher before the Ascendants turned his city into a crater, and who now loaded explosives like a man measuring ingredients for a recipe. There was Elias, a physicist who looked at the beacon with a kind of reverent curiosity and who explained, in English threaded with sighs, why an anchor looked like the thing it held. They were not heroes when they met. They were people who were angry, wounded, tired, and for the first time gripped by a coordinated purpose that felt larger than their grief. Helen watched them when they did not know she was watching, and she let herself be surprised by how much she cared for them, by how much it hurt to think of losing them. That care hardened into responsibility. Holloway, for his part, stayed close enough to be felt but not so close that his presence became a leash. He moved through their practice like a captain checking a rig, silent, measuring, pausing at the right moments to offer a phrase that mattered. Once, late in the corridor, he found Helen standing with her back to the observation window, the whole of Europa spread out like a pattern on black cloth. He did not ask how she felt. He only said, "Every plan we make is a conversation with luck. Make peace with it." When the launch came it was hurried, not because they wanted to hurry, but because there were fewer and fewer places to hide by the day. They left under the cover of a manufactured storm, hollow atmospheric charges designed to throw the Doomspire's sensors into confusion for exactly 12 minutes. 12 minutes to get close. 12 minutes to do the impossible. The insertion itself was a ballet of human error and quiet genius. Tiny skimmer pods cut through the edge of the Doomspire's influence like stone through water. They slipped through sensor gaps, rode on neutrino shadows, and used a small ship's heat signature to mimic a fallen debris field. Jonah's hands were steady as he piloted their pod into a service aperture that creaked like an old throat when it opened. They entered a world that seemed to have been designed by architects who had never seen a human face. Angles contradicted expectation. Corridors bent in ways that made sense only when gravity was not a guarantee. There were rooms that hummed with a low pulse, a sound you felt behind your teeth more than you heard. The first resistance they met was a net, not of flesh, but of instrumentation. Small drones like metallic fish hovered in the hall, their lenses flicking to life with a sound like breath. Jonah imploded a charge at the right frequency, frying the drone sensors without setting off the larger alarm. It was a tiny victory that tasted like victory at last. Then the Doomspire woke. It was not a single moment of recognition. It was a cascade, an awareness like a ripple becoming a wave. A sequence of lights pulsed along the conduit lines. A tone, impossible to replicate, moved through the structure and set every drone to a hunt pattern. In the span of a breath, the corridors filled not with metal fish but with the slow, terrible discipline of the Ascendant's design. Someone shouted. Jonah cursed in a language Helen did not always understand. They ran. They fought through a dozen rooms that looked like machine caves. The Ascendant drones were faster than anything human engineers had built. They fought with a clinical economy, disabling limbs and sensory nodes rather than charging in a scream. The team learned, quickly and painfully, that brute force was the last thing that would keep them alive. They had to be surgical, precise in ways that made them sweat. Oliver never left Helen's side. More than once he pulled her out of a choke where she would have been trapped. He was not reckless in a showy way. He was careful in a way that kept them breathing. At one point Helen found him standing over a conduit, face lit by the alien glow, whispering into his wrist mic as if talking to someone he hoped to return to. "You okay?" she asked, and his reply was a short laugh that did not reach his eyes. "As okay as someone who just signed up for a date with a machine that eats suns," he said. They reached the anchor nodes after false corridors and after a corridor that looped back on itself in a way that swallowed a man's sense of direction. The anchor nodes were not what any human schematic would predict. They looked like ribs of light, held in place by lattices that seemed to hum with an ancient patience. All around them, embedded in the metal, were patterns that looked like languages if you squinted. Helen felt a surge of nausea. It was the kind that came when you realized what you were touching was older than you thought. Elias, who had insisted on the team being careful and reverent, stepped forward with a set of instruments and began to read the anchor. He spoke in a voice that flapped between elation and terror. "If we can fracture these lattices at specific nodes, it will destabilize the anchor's coupling to stellar energy supply." He pointed to a set of lines that ran back into the spine of the Doomspire. "We need to sever here, here, and here." They set the charges. They ran their sequences. It was the most human thing they had done in a long time, a blend of improvisation and learned technique. Helen felt the weight of history and of her brother's memory and of every face she had seen burned into the memory of a colony. She told herself to focus on the mechanics, the angles, the timing. She told herself to breathe. The first cut went clean. The anchor shuddered like a beast reacting to pain. A low keening spread through the Doomspire. For a breath they believed. Then the structure responded not with a collapse but with a change of shape. The lattices began to realign. The anchor did not bleed the way the beacon had promised. It rerouted. Helen's chest tightened. She had accepted risk. She had not accepted failure. "New plan," she said, though the phrase inside the metal halls sounded like a plea. "We trigger the secondary nodes, force reroute cascade." Elias's fingers scrambled across his console. "That will overload local subsystems, but it might trigger a defensive response. The chain reaction could do what?" Jonah snapped. "Could seal the anchor into a locked state," Elias said. "Or it could accelerate destabilization to the point of structural failure. It is," he tried to find a word. "It is a gamble." Helen did not believe in a world where they could avoid gambles forever. She believed in a world where you took them when the ledger weighed too heavily on one side. She nodded. "We take it." They initiated the sequence. For a moment the world held its breath with them. Light flared along the ribs. Sound became a presence, a living thing that made Helen's teeth ache. Then alarms began to ripple through the structure like a chorus of animals rising to some terrible awareness. They had not miscalculated. The reroute worked. The anchor began to convulse. That triumph lasted a span measured in heartbeats. Then the Doomspire did something they had not predicted because nobody had predicted this level of adaptive design in a weapon. The structure reconfigured, and at the same time it locked down around them. Doors sealed with the finality of a tomb. Gravity shifted. Corridors pinched. The very geometry they had used to move through its insides became a trap. Oliver shoved a panel, his face sharp. "We are cut off." The access way collapsed. Helen ran toward the back of the tunnel as the crew scrambled. Jonah hit a lever and the wall folded back like skin. Something grabbed his ankle. He fell. Helen dove, dragging him free, hearing the sound of bones screaming. Jonah gritted his teeth and coughed blood from the corner of his mouth, and for a silent second they all recognized how fragile even fierce resolve could be. A voice came over their comms. Not ascendant, not human. It was a broadcast, layered and alien, but it carried, translated by the hull's emergency modulator into a tone that made the hairs on Helen's arms rise. "You were not recorded," it said, and the phrasing made no attempt at malice. It was the same voice that might announce opening hours. It was the voice that announced finality. Helen felt as if the room had drawn a line under something important. They had made a cut. The anchor had bled, but the Doomspire had learned. It had closed a circuit. It was not going to let a human hand undo what it had been designed to do. Oliver looked at her, and for the first time she saw in him the look of someone measuring the distance between courage and consequence. He swallowed. "We break out," he said. "We find a way to the surface, and Holloway brings the fleet. We give them a window to finish what we started." Helen's hands were cold. She wanted to say yes and mean it and feel it. She wanted to hold that certainty like a weapon. But the structure hummed around them, and somewhere in its shifting a new sound was born, low and gathering like a drum. Something vast was waking in the Doomspire's core. It answered their cut not with surrender, but with attention. Their window, if they still had one, was closing faster than anything they had rehearsed. Helen swallowed and said, "Then we make it count." They moved as one, a chain of people stitched by weariness and stubbornness. The corridors hunched and shifted around them, throwing them into dead ends and into places that smelled like cold metal and old wars. The outer sensors flickered, and the tiny displays that had shown them a route blinked red and went dark. Outside, through the thin slits of the hull, Helen could see the Doomspire's outer surface glowing with a new pattern, the same sickly light that had made continents pale from a distance. It was as if the whole thing were waking up to the idea that it had been hurt. Helen's hand found Oliver's as they shoveled through a jammed door. He did not squeeze back. He did not need to. There was a readiness in his eyes that matched hers. He had become something quiet and necessary, the sort of human that remembers to put another's oxygen mask on first when alarms go off. They made it to a maintenance access shaft that led to an external port. Jonah was limping. Elias deadpanned a joke that made no one laugh but broke the tension for a second. Maeve had taken to humming a tune that she said reminded her of a dog she had once owned, And for a moment the sound in that alien gut of steel and light was almost tender. Then the Doomspire closed a circuit around them. The maintenance shaft sealed like a maw. The port they had aimed for filed away into the hull. A pressure wave slammed through the corridor, a fossilized sound like the echo of a bell. The lights dimmed. The hull groaned. Oliver's console screeched. The outer grid is forming a field. It is like a cage. Helen clicked through the failing mainframe with hands that refused to tremble. She could see the math and the odds, and all of them made her stomach turn. They had forced the Doomspire to reroute, and in doing so they had forced it to adapt. It was responding with a containment protocol. "Take the rockets," she said. "We force a breach. We blow through the hull and ride the shock out. We do not give up." Elias's mouth was a line that will trigger an external tie-down. If the structural weave decides to hold, it will clamp and compress the port. It could crush anyone inside. "Then we time it so the clamp engages after the breach initiates," Jonah said. He had a hand on the explosives pack, eyes burning with a need to finish what they had started. Helen looked at Oliver. "You read the sequences. You tell me when to burn." He nodded. He did not look away. "On my mark." The team braced. The charges were set. Fingers hovered. Maeve whispered another of her dog tunes. It felt absurd and human in a place where absurdity had no right to exist. Then the charge went off. The hull split like paper. A blinding rush of external light slammed into the shaft. Heat smacked them. There was a roar that shifted everything inside Helen. It felt like being inside an instrument played loudly. For a second they were free, the outside world filling their vision like a new sun. Then something reached for them. Not a drone. Not a weapon in a way any human had seen before. It was a lattice that flowed like liquid metal, threading itself into the breach, working with the patience of long engineering. It was as if the Doomspire had grown fingers and they were not interested in negotiation. The external field grabbed Jonah's leg. He was pulled partway out, screaming, and then a node connected to his pack and a flash of light took him. Helen lunged, and Oliver wrapped an arm around her waist and hauled, and for a breath they were both dragged toward the outside by the yawning pressure. Holloway's voice filled their calm like a bell. "We are engaging the fleet." He did not ask whether they were alive. He stated it the way a man declares an order because there is no time left for questions. "We will tear that thing apart if you give us a target. Hold on." Helen's world narrowed to the screaming of air and the taste of metal and the sight of Jonah's hand slipping. She reached, fingers brushing his sleeve. He looked at her, and for an instant he was not the man with a limp and a cracked tooth but a human being who had made a choice to be brave. He smiled, ridiculous and true, and mouthed something she could not hear. She felt a hardness in her chest form, a resolve that was very near to panic but cleaner, sharper, and she realized it had nothing to do with victory. It had to do with the people behind her and the people still ahead of them, floating like points of light above the dark. The maintenance shaft shuddered and then gave way. They were dragged into a narrow exterior channel as the Doomspire's outer weave sealed and reshaped itself around the wound. The hull closed with surgical speed. The breach sealed into a line of metal that looked nothing like the seam they had made. It was as if the Doomspire had swallowed their attempt whole and had decided to digest it. Helen's throat was raw. Her suit HUD showed structural integrity falling off like tiles. Oliver's face glittered with fear and a fierce, stubborn resolve. He looked at a display no one else could see and then at her. "We kicked the hornet's nest," he said. "Now we need to get clear so Holloway can aim." She wanted to say something defiant and wise. Instead she tasted blood and grit and the memory of a child coughing in an alley. She thought of her brother and of all the small human things that had pushed her into this. She said, "Then we run. We get out, and we do not let them make us into a footnote." They began to move. The Doomspire's hull tightened like a fist. The exterior channel vibrated with energy designed to keep life out. Every step was a fight against a field intent on making them still. And then, with the suddenness of a collapsing bridge, the Doomspire altered its configuration once more. For a fraction of a second the structure revealed a long, dark throat that seemed to lead deeper than any of their schematics suggested. At the center of that throat something shifted, and a low tone filled the air that did not belong to any instrument they had. It was deep and resonant and carried with it the feeling of a mind acknowledging its opponent. Oliver's voice went quiet in Helen's ear. "They are responding, and they are learning faster than we anticipated." Helen swallowed, her mouth dry. "Then we just have to learn faster," she said. She tried to make the words sound like hope and not like a bargaining chip. Outside, the Doomspire's skin glowed with patterns that might once have been ornamental and were now intelligence. Something vast was waking in its architecture. Something that would not be glad to lose what it had consumed. They were not out yet. They had not even reached the moment that would prove whether their sacrifice would shift the tide or only rearrange the ashes. As the channel drew them in like a magnet, the last thing Helen saw was a flash of light that moved across the Doomspire's surface, a line of energy tracing from one anchor point to another. And then the entire structure changed shape in a way that made her stomach fall. The Doomspire was not a static weapon. It was an organism, and it had just decided to fight back in a manner that made every plan they had look small. The shuttle rode the edge of silence as it drifted past the shadow of Europa. The ice world glimmered faintly beneath, broken by cracks of fire where the ascendants had already struck. Europa colony's distress signals screamed faintly across comms, but Helen muted them. She couldn't listen. Not now. Oliver sat at the pilot's controls, hands steady but jaw tight. His humor had evaporated somewhere between orbit and the Doomspire's gravity well. The alien fortress loomed ahead, a mountain of impossible design, bristling with spires that seemed to pierce space itself. Its surface shimmered faintly, as if covered in glassy scales, alive and shifting. Inside the hold, the strike team checked their gear. 6 of them total, plus Helen and Oliver. Holloway hadn't joined, though his last words before launch lingered in Helen's head. "If you come back, make sure it's worth the blood it costs you." She gripped the handrail as the shuttle cut into the spire's defensive field. Static clawed across the hull, rattling teeth, shaking bones. For a moment, she thought the ship would peel apart, but then they slid through with a sickening lurch. Inside, the Doomspire was no less monstrous. Towers of alien alloy twisted into impossible angles, archways opened into black nothing, and pulses of green-white light moved like veins beneath the surface. The interior wasn't built, it was grown. "Jesus Christ," one of the Marines muttered. "It's alive." Helen steadied her breathing. "Focus. We hit the anchors, we cripple it. That's all that matters." Oliver killed the shuttle's power, letting it drift to a jagged landing bay. No hangars, no lights, just a raw cavity carved into the structure. The Marines filed out first, rifles raised, scanning the alien dark. Helen followed, her boots clanging against the metal organic floor. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of their own breaths, the distant pulse of energy through the walls, and the weight of being inside something that had erased a dozen colonies without pause. Then came the first movement. Shadows peeled off the walls, rising into forms. The ascendants weren't flesh. They were constructs of light and steel, bodies flowing like liquid armor, faces a blur of inhuman geometry. They made no sound as they moved, only the hiss of shifting matter. The firefight erupted instantly. Bolts of plasma tore into the darkness, ricocheting off alien plating. The Marines shouted, cursed, fired in disciplined bursts, but the constructs pressed forward without hesitation. Helen ducked behind a ridge, her rifle shaking in her hands. She wasn't a soldier. Not like them. But she fired anyway, the recoil slamming into her shoulder, her shots cutting through one of the constructs before it reformed, broken geometry scattering across the floor like shards of glass. "Go!" Oliver's voice cut through the chaos. "We don't win this fight, we move past it." The team broke into a run, forcing their way deeper into the spire. The corridors bent unnaturally, angles that shouldn't exist, spaces that made no architectural sense. Twice they doubled back, realizing they'd been looped into the same chamber. The place was fighting them, reshaping itself as they moved. One Marine vanished mid-stride, swallowed by a wall that had been solid a second earlier. His scream echoed for an instant, then nothing. Helen froze, bile in her throat, but Oliver shoved her forward. "Don't stop. Keep moving." They reached the first anchor chamber almost by accident, stumbling into a vast cathedral-like hall. At its center pulsed a crystalline structure, tethered to the spire by tendrils of energy. The anchor glowed with a rhythm, beating like a heart. The Marines set charges immediately, working with mechanical efficiency. Helen approached the anchor, her skin prickling as the energy reached for her, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. She pulled back, teeth clenched. "Charges ready." The floor shuddered before they could prime them. More constructs poured in from the walls, flowing like rivers of steel. The team opened fire, but there were too many. One Marine went down, then another. The detonator slipped from trembling fingers. Helen dove for it, slamming her palm on the trigger. The explosion roared, shaking the chamber, ripping through the anchor. The crystalline heart fractured, screaming as light poured out in every direction. The constructs convulsed, their forms collapsing into fragments. The anchor split apart, its energy bleeding into the walls like smoke. For the first time, the Doomspire seemed to falter, a tremor running through its bones. But it wasn't victory. Not yet. As the dust settled, Oliver grabbed Helen by the arm. "That was one. How many more of these things do you think it has?" Helen looked back at the broken anchor, then at the endless corridors stretching into blackness. Her chest ached with fear, but her voice was steady. "Enough to bleed it dry. If we live long enough to find them." The walls shifted again, the floor tilting beneath their boots. Somewhere deep inside the spire, something screamed, not machine, not human, but alive. And the sound was moving toward them. The Doomspire shuddered as if it knew it had been wounded. The corridors twisted more violently now, walls collapsing into new shapes, floors splitting beneath their boots. The team staggered forward, battered, bloodied, but alive. Only 4 Marines remained. Faces grim, eyes hollow. They didn't ask how many more anchor chambers there were. They just kept moving because stopping meant dying in a place that erased names and swallowed history. Oliver limped slightly, blood soaking through the fabric at his side. He hadn't mentioned it, but Helen saw the stiffness in every step. She wanted to say something, to slow down, but there wasn't time. The spire was hunting them now. They reached the second anchor after nearly an hour of blind running, guided only by a faint pulse in the air. It looked different than the first, darker, threads of shadow weaving through its crystal veins. The Marines placed charges without hesitation. This time Helen didn't touch it, but she felt its presence pressing into her skull, whispering images of surrender. The detonation ripped through the chamber. The spire screamed again, louder, like a beast being gutted. For a heartbeat, the lights across its vast structure dimmed, and Europa colony below flickered with hope. But hope lasted seconds. The Doomspire retaliated. Constructs surged by the dozens, pouring from ceilings, floors, walls. The firefight was chaos, bolts of light tearing through the Marines. 2 went down before the second anchor fully collapsed. The survivors dragged themselves out, barely holding the line. Oliver pulled Helen into cover, breathing hard. His voice was hoarse. 2 anchors down, and this thing's still standing. Tell me there's an end to this. Helen's reply caught in her throat. Then she saw it, a central corridor, wide, lined with jagged spines. At the end pulsed the largest chamber yet, glowing so bright it seemed to burn holes into the air. "The core," she whispered. They moved as one, pushing toward it. Every step felt heavier, as if gravity itself had thickened. The chamber opened before them, impossibly vast, a cathedral of living light. At its center floated the final anchor, colossal, suspended by strands of energy that reached into the bones of the spire. It was alive, throbbing aware. The last Marine set the final charges, his hands shaking. Before he could finish, a construct twice the size of any they had faced emerged from the walls. Its form was jagged, monstrous, half solid, half light, as if the spire itself had chosen a champion. The Marine fired until his rifle overheated, but it wasn't enough. The construct crushed him in an instant. Helen and Oliver were alone. The construct advanced. Helen raised her weapon, but her shots barely slowed it. She felt the pull of the anchor, urging her to kneel, to give in. Her legs buckled, her chest burned. She almost dropped the rifle. Then Oliver stepped forward. His face was pale, sweat pouring down, blood dark across his side. He gripped a fallen detonator in one hand and forced a grin through his teeth. "Looks like you were right, Helen. We don't run anymore." Before she could stop him, he sprinted toward the anchor. The construct lunged, skewering him through the chest, but Oliver slammed the detonator against the crystalline surface. His last breath was a curse, spit through blood. The explosion tore the chamber apart. Light roared like a supernova, ripping through the anchor, unraveling the spire from the inside out. The construct shrieked as its body dissolved into shards of nothing. Helen was thrown back, her body slamming into the floor, ears ringing, vision white. She crawled, half-conscious, toward the shuttle bay as the Doomspire collapsed around her. Every wall fractured, every corridor melted into fire. She made it to the shuttle with seconds to spare, slamming the hatch as the spire convulsed one last time. The launch threw her into orbit, tumbling, spinning, watching through the viewport as the impossible fortress cracked, folded, and imploded. From Europa Colony, millions looked up and saw it. The Doomspire, collapsing in silence, light pouring out like a dying star. For the first time in months, cheers rose through human space. On the shuttle, Helen sat alone, hands shaking, chest heaving. Oliver's blood was still on her jacket. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass, staring at the debris field. Humanity had won, but not cleanly, not without cost. And in the wreckage, drifting silently, pieces of alien alloy still pulsed faintly. Helen closed her eyes. Somewhere deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far worse.